Okay, sorry, I have to. This is my second recording of this because I got 3 minutes into the other one and I realized there was a bunch of paper in my mouth, which is really weird. But, anyways, okay. So, yeah, I'm skipping. I have to re explain. Where was I? Okay, I'm skipping the Makers of America because I have to go somewhere soon. I want to make sure I have time to upload this and everything. So, I hope that's okay. It's about this thing called the Oneida community, which has a little paragraph in like the main text actually, so it'll get covered. But yeah, I was recording. There was a bunch of paper in my mouth, which is really gross. But anyways, um, yeah. So starting on 321, wilderness utopias. Oh, and I got a new pair of earbuds, so I hope that the audio is okay. Anyways. Bolstered by the utopian spirit of the age, various reformers, ranging from the high-minded to the lunatic fringe, set up more than 40 communities of a cooperative, communistic, or communitarian nature. Seeking human betterment, a wealthy and idealist Scottish textile manufacturer, Robert Owen, founded in 1825 a communal society of about 1,000 people at New Harmony, Indiana. Little harmony prevailed in the colony, which, in addition to hard-working visionaries, attracted a sprinkling of radicals, work-shy theorists, and outright scoundrels. The colony sank in a morass of contradiction and confusion. Brook Farm in Massachusetts, comprising 200 acres of grudging soil, was started in 1841 with the brotherly and sisterly cooperation of about 20 intellectuals committed to the philosophy of transcendentalism. They prospered reasonably well until 1846, when they lost by fire a large new communal building shortly before its completion. The whole venture in plain living and high thinking then collapsed in debt. The Brook Farm experiment inspired Nathaniel Hawthorne's classic novel, The Blithedale Romance. A more radical experiment was the Oneida community, founded in New York in 1848. It practiced free love, complex marriage, birth control through male continence or coitus reservatus, and the eugenic selection of parents to produce superior offspring. This curious enterprise flourished for more than 30 years, largely because its artisans made superior steel traps and Oneida community silver plate. Various communist experiments, mostly small in scale, have been attempted since the founding of Jamestown in 1607, but in competition with democratic free enterprise and free land, virtually all of them sooner or later failed or changed their methods. Along the longest-lived sects were the Shakers, founded in England in 1747 and brought to America in 1774 by Mother Ann Lee. She moved her tiny band of followers to upstate New York, the first of a score or so of American Shaker communities. The Shakers attained a membership of about 6,000 in 1840, but since their monastic customs prohibited both marriage and sexual relations, they were virtually extinct by 1940. It's so much better with no paper in my mouth. The dawn of scientific achievement. Early Americans, confronted with pioneering problems, were more interested in practical gadgets than in pure science. Jefferson, for example, was a gifted amateur inventor who won a gold medal for a new type of plow. Noteworthy also were the writings of a mathematician, Nathaniel Bowditch, on practical navigation of the oceanographer Matthew F. Maury on ocean winds and currents. These writers promoted safety, speed, and economy, but as far as basic science was concerned, Americans were best known for borrowing and adapting the findings of Europeans. Yet the Republic was not without scientific talent. The most influential American scientist of the first half of the 19th century was Professor Benjamin Silliman, a pioneer chemist and geologist who taught and wrote brilliantly at Yale College for more than 50 years. Professor Louis Agassiz, a distinguished French-Swiss immigrant, served for a quarter of a century at Harvard College. A path-breaking student of biology who sometimes carried snakes in his pockets, he insisted on original research and deplored the reigning overemphasis on memory work. Professor Asa Gray of Harvard College, the Columbus of American botany, published over 350 books, monographs, and papers. His textbooks set new standards for clarity and interest. Lovers of American bird lore owed much to the French-descended naturalist John J. Audubon, who painted wildfowl in their natural habitat. His magnificently illustrated Birds of America attained considerable popularity. The Audubon Society for the Protection of Birds was named after him, although as a young man he shot much feathered game for sport. Medicine in America, despite a steady growth of medical schools, was still primitive by modern standards. Bleeding remained a common cure and a curse as well. Smallpox plagues were still dreaded, and the yellow fever epidemic of 1793 in Philadelphia took several thousand lives. "Bring out your dead," was the daily cry of the corpse wagon drivers. People everywhere complained of ill health, malaria and the rheumatics, the miseries and the chills. Illness often resulted from improper diet, hurried eating, perspiring and cooling off too rapidly, and ignorance of germs and sanitation. "We was sick every fall, regular," wrote the mother of a future President James Garfield. Life expectancy was still dismayingly short, about 40 years for a white person born in 1850, and less for blacks. The suffering from decayed or ulcerated teeth was enormous. Tooth extraction was often practiced by the muscular village blacksmith. Self-prescribed patent medicines were common, 1 dose for people, 2 for horses, and included Robertson's infallible worm-destroying lozenges. Fad diets proved popular, including the whole wheat bread and crackers regimen of Sylvester Graham. Among home remedies was the rubbing of tumors with dead toads. The use of medicine by regular doctors was often harmful, and Dr. Oliver Wendell Holmes declared in 1860 that if the medicines, as then employed, were thrown into the sea, humans would be better off and the fish worse off. Victims of surgical operations were ordinarily tied down, often after a stiff drink of whiskey. The surgeon then sawed or cut with breakneck speed, undeterred by the piercing shrieks of the patient. Oh my god. A priceless boon for medical progress came in the early 1840s when several American doctors and dentists working independently successfully employed laughing gas and either as anesthetics. Excuse me. Artistic achievements. As early as the 1770s, revolutionary Americans anticipated that a great cultural flourishing would accompany America's political awakening. Optimistic commentators spoke of the rise and glory of America, sharing the British philosopher George Berkeley's prediction in 1752 that westward the course of the empire takes its way. Time's noblest offspring is its last. But while American political thought sparkled with originality, the nation's earliest cultural forays proved less than spectacular. Flush with political independence, Americans strained to achieve cultural autonomy and create a national art worthy of their aspirations. Architecturally, America chose to imitate Old World styles rather than create indigenous ones. Early national builders articulated a plain federal style of architecture that borrowed from classical Greek and Roman examples and emphasized symmetry, balance, and restraint. Public buildings incorporated a neoclassic vocabulary of columns, domes, and pediments to suggest venerable ancient models for America's novel Republican experiment. Charles Bulfinch's design of the Massachusetts State House, 1798, and Benjamin Latrobe's early 19th century additions to the U.S. Capitol and President's House, now White House, showcased this neoclassical obsession. A remarkable Greek revival came between 1820 and 1850, partly stimulated by the heroic efforts of the Greeks in the 1820s to wrest independence from the terrible Turk. Popularized in pattern books for carpenters, plain and porticoed Greek revival houses proliferated across America, especially in New York's burned-over district and the Old Northwest. About mid-century, strong interest developed in a revival of medieval Gothic forms, with their emphasis on pointed arches, sloped roofs, and large stained-glass windows. Talented Thomas Jefferson, architect of the Revolution, was one of the ablest American architects of his generation. Inspired by the 16th century Venetian architect Andrea Palladio, Jefferson's Virginia hilltop home, Monticello, arose as perhaps the most stately mansion in the nation and an iconic example of the Palladian style. Jefferson also modeled Richmond's new state capital on an ancient Roman temple, the Maison Carrée, which he had visited while minister to France. The quadrangle of the University of Virginia at Charlottesville, another of Jefferson's creations, remains one of the finest examples of neoclassical architecture in America. Early American painting also struggled to find a distinctive national style. Imitative portraiture and history painting predominated in the late 18th century, as American artists attempted to cover their provincial culture with a civilizing veneer. Painting suffered from the dollar-grabbing of a raw civilization, from the hustle, bustle, and absence of leisure, from the lack of a wealthy class to sit for portraits and then pay for them. Some of the earliest painters, including Benjamin West, were enticed to go to England, where they found both training and patrons. America exported artists and imported art. Painting, like the theater, also suffered from the Puritan prejudice that art was a sinful waste of time, and often obscene. John Adams boasted that he would not give a sixpence for a bust of Phidias, or a painting by Raphael. When Edward Everett, the eminent Boston scholar and orator, placed a statue of Apollo in his home, he had its naked limbs draped. Competent painters nevertheless emerged. Gilbert Stuart, a restless Rhode Islander and one of the most gifted of the early group, wielded his brush in Britain in competition with the best artists. Returning to America in 1793, he produced several portraits of Washington, all of them somewhat idealized and humanized. One of them appears on the familiar $1 bill. Truth to tell, by the time he posed for Stuart, the famous general had lost his natural teeth and some of the original shape of his face. Charles Wilson Peale, 1741 to 1827, Marylander, painted some 60 portraits of Washington, who patiently sat for about 14 of them. John Trumbull, who had fought in the Revolutionary War, recaptured its heroic scenes and spirit on scores of striking canvases. After the War of 1812, American painters turned increasingly from human portraits to history paintings to pastoral mirrorings of local landscapes. In America's vast wilderness, the new nation's painters finally found their distinctive muse. The Hudson River School of the 1820s and 1830s excelled in this type of romantic art. Its leading lights, British-born Thomas Cole and New Jerseyan Asher Durand, celebrated the raw sublimity and grand divinity of nature. Cole's canvases, including the Oxbow, 1836, portrayed the ecological threat of human encroachment on once pristine environments. His masterpiece five-part series, The Course of Empire, depicted the cyclical rise and fall of human civilization, a powerful analogy for 19th century Americans anxious about industrialization and expansion. Around mid-century, Around mid-century, a group of Luminist painters, including German-born Albert Bierstadt, dramatically and sometimes fancifully rendered majestic natural landscapes in the same romantic tradition. At the same time, new technologies reframed the artistic landscape. Portrait painters gradually encountered some unwelcome competition from the invention of a crude photograph known as the daguerreotype, perfected by about 1839 by a Frenchman, Louis Daguerre. Cheap and easily reproducible lithographs, most notably from the New York City firm of Currier and Ives, offered picturesque scenes and city views to millions of consumers. Music was slowly shaking off the restraints of colonial days, when the prim Puritans had frowned upon non-religious singing. Rhythmic and nostalgic darky tunes, popularized by whites, were becoming immense hits by mid-century. Special favorites were the uniquely American minstrel shows, featuring white actors with blackened faces playing stock plantation characters. For the survival of blackface performances. Oh wait, that's just a thing. Dixie, later adopted by the Confederates as their battle hymn, was written in 1859, ironically in New York City by an Ohioan. The most famous Southern songs also, ironically, came from a white Pennsylvanian, Stephen C. Foster. His one excursion into the South occurred in 1852, after he had published Camptown Races, Old Folks at Home, and Oh, Susanna, the anthem of California gold rushers. Foster made a valuable contribution to American folk music by capturing the plaintive spirit of the slaves. An odd and pathetic figure, he finally lost both his art and his popularity and died in a charity ward after drowning his sorrows in drink. Lacking adequate copyright protection, songwriters in this era earned pennies, not profits. Oh, I dropped my mic. Hold on. Wait, where is it? Okay, the blossoming of a national literature. In the four quarters of the globe sneered a British critic of 1820 who reads an American book or goes to an American play or looks at an American picture or statue. Like their sisterly artistic pursuits, early American literary efforts also fell short of initial expectations. Despite an unusually literate population, post-revolutionary America imported or plagiarized much of its polite reading matter from Britain. Busy conquering a continent, Americans poured most of their creative efforts into practical outlets, praiseworthy political essays, like the Federalist Papers of Hamilton, Jay, and Madison, pamphlets like Tom Paine's Common Sense, and political orations like the masterpieces of Daniel Webster. In the category of non-religious books published before 1820, Benjamin Franklin's autobiography is one of the few that achieved genuine distinction. His narrative is a classic in its simplicity, clarity, and inspirational quality. Even so, it records only a fragment of the old Ben's long, fruitful, and amorous life. After 1820, a confident cohort of young American authors finally began to answer the call for an authentic national literature. Their rise corresponded with the wave of nationalism following the War of 1812 and the arrival of Romanticism on American shores. Conceived as a reaction against the hyper-rational Enlightenment, Romanticism originated in the revolutionary salons of continental Europe and England. In direct contrast to neoclassicism, Romanticism emphasized imagination over reason, nature over civilization, intuition over calculation, and the self over society. Emotion, expression, and experimentation were core values. Upsetting the restrained, clock-like universe of the 18th century philosophers, 19th century romantics elevated primal nature in all its sublime and picturesque glory. They celebrated human potential and prized the heroic genius of the individual artist. Infused with romantic energy, American literature flowered in the mid-19th century as never before. Washington Irving, born in New York City, was the first American to win international recognition as a literary figure. Steeped in the traditions of New Netherland, he published in 1809 his amusing Knickerbocker's History of New York, with its local color caricatures of the Dutch. When the family business failed, Irving was forced to turn to the goose feather pen. In 1819 to 1820, he published The Sketchbook, which brought him immediate fame at home and abroad. Combining a pleasing style with delicate charm and quiet humor, he used English as well as American themes and included such immortal Gothic tales as Rip Van Winkle and The Legend of Sleepy Hollow. Europe was amazed to find that at least an American with a feather in his hand, not at last an American with a feather in his hand, not in his hair. Later turning to Spanish locales and biography, Irving did much to interpret America to Europe and Europe to America. He was, said the Englishman William Thackeray, the first ambassador whom the New World of Letters sent to the Old. Sorry, I was taking a sip. James Fenimore Cooper followed on Irving's coattails and gained world fame, marking New World themes respectable. Expelled from Yale, he eventually married into a wealthy family and settled down on the New York frontier. Reading one day to his wife from an insipid English novel, Cooper remarked in disgust that he could write a better book himself. His wife challenged him to do so, and he did. After an initial failure, Cooper launched an illustrious career in 1821 with his second novel, The Spy, an absorbing tale of the American Revolution. His stories of the sea were meritorious and popular, but his fame rests most enduringly on his 5 leather-stocking tales, featuring a dead-eye rifleman named Natty Bumppo, a solitary and self-reliant hero who mingles easily with nature's noble savages in stirring adventures like The Last of the Mohicans. Cooper's novels sold well to Europeans, some of whom came to think of all American people as born with tomahawk in hand. Actually, Cooper's deepest theme was an exploration of the viability and destiny of America's Republican experiment. He contrasted the undefiled purity of natural men, children of the untrammeled wilderness, with the artificiality and corruption of modern civilization. Cooper's emblematic tales of the vanishing frontier offered literary analogues of the Hudson River School's visual landscapes. Along with Irving and Cooper, the third member of New York's trailblazing Knickerbocker group was the belated Puritan William Cullen Bryant, transplanted from Massachusetts. At age 16, he wrote the meditative and melancholy Thanatopsis, which was one of the first high-quality poems produced in the United States. Critics could hardly believe that it had been written on this side of the water, although Bryant continued with poetry. He made his living by editing the influential New York Evening Post. For over 50 years, he set a model for journalism that was dignified, liberal, and conscientious. Got ice in my mouth. Okay. Trumpeters of Transcendentalism. A golden age in American literature dawned in the second quarter of the 19th century, when an amazing outburst struck New England. One of the mainsprings of this literary flowering was Transcendentalism, especially around Boston, which preened itself as the Athens of America. The Transcendentalist movement of the 1830s resulted in part from a liberalizing of the straitjacket Puritan theology. It also owed much to foreign influences, including the German Romantic philosophers and the religions of Asia. The Transcendentalists rejected the prevailing empiricist theory derived from John Locke, that all knowledge comes to the mind through the senses. Truth, rather, transcends the senses. It cannot be found by observation alone. Every person possesses an inner light that can illuminate the highest truth and put him or her in direct touch with God, or the Oversoul. These mystical doctrines of Transcendentalism defied precise definition, but they underlay concrete beliefs. Foremost was a stiff-backed individualism in matters religious as well as social. Closely associated was a commitment to self-reliance, self-culture, and self-discipline. These traits naturally bred hostility to authority and to formal institutions of any kind, as well as to all conventional wisdom. Finally came a romantic... I gotta take a sip again, hold on. Finally came a romantic exaltation of the dignity of the individual, whether black or white, the mainspring of a whole array of humanitarian reforms. Best known of the Transcendentalists was Boston-born Ralph Waldo Emerson. Tall, slender, and intensely blue-eyed, he mirrored serenity in his noble features. Trained as a Unitarian minister, he early forsook his pulpit and ultimately reached a wider audience by pen and platform. He was a never-failing favorite as a Lyceum lecturer, and for 20 years took a Western tour every winter. Perhaps his most thrilling public effort was a Phi Beta Kappa address, The American Scholar, delivered at Harvard College in 1837. This brilliant appeal was an intellectual declaration of independence, for it urged American writers to throw off European traditions and delve into the riches of their own backyards. Hailed as both a poet and a philosopher, Emerson was not of the highest rank as either. He was more influential as a practical philosopher and public intellectual. Through his fresh and vibrant essays, he enriched countless thousands of humdrum lives. Catching the individualistic mood of the Republic, he stressed self-reliance, self-improvement, self-confidence, optimism, and freedom, though he also criticized American triumphalism of the Jacksonian brand. By the 1850s, he was an outspoken critic of slavery, and he ardently supported the Union cause in the Civil War. Henry David Thoreau was Emerson's close associate, a poet, a mystic, a transcendentalist, and a nonconformist. Condemning a government that supported slavery, he refused to pay his Massachusetts poll tax and was jailed for a night. A gifted prose writer, he is well known for Walden, or Life in the Woods. The book is a record of Thoreau's 2 years of a simple existence in a hut that he built on the edge of a Walden pond near Concord, Massachusetts. Walden epitomized the romantic quest for isolation from society's corruptions. A stiff-necked individualist, Thoreau believed that he should reduce his bodily wants so as to gain time to pursue truth through study and meditation. Thoreau's Walden and his essay on the duty of civil disobedience exercised a strong influence in furthering idealistic thought, both in America and abroad. His writings later encouraged Mahatma Gandhi to resist British rule in India and, still later, inspired the development of American civil rights leader Martin Luther King Jr.'s thinking about nonviolence. Precocious Margaret Fuller befriended Emerson around the time of his Phi Beta Kappa address in 1837 and soon joined the Boston Circle of Transcendentalists. She edited the movement's journal, The Dial, for 2 years after its founding in 1840. In the same year, she launched her series of conversations, or paid seminars designed to promote scholarly dialogue among local elite women and some invited men. Known for her sparkling conversational wit, Fuller also wrote prolifically. In 1845, she published Women in the 19th Century, a powerful critique of gender roles and an iconic statement of the budding feminist movement. After an influential stint as literary editor of Horace Greeley's New York Tribune, Fuller sailed for Europe and eventually took part in the struggle to bring unity and Republican government to Italy. She died tragically in a shipwreck off New York's Fire Island while returning to the United States in 1850. Bold, brassy, and swaggering was the open-collared figure of Brooklyn's Walt Whitman. In his famous collection of poems, Leaves of Grass, he gave free rein to his gushing genius with what he called a barbaric yawp. His landmark song of Myself, with its unabashed first-person speaker, celebrated the romantic artist hero in free verse. Highly emotional and unconventional, Whitman dispensed with titles, stanzas, rhymes, and at times even regular meter. He located divinity in commonplace natural objects, as well as the human body. Whitman even handled sex with shocking frankness, although he laundered his verses in later editions, and his book was banned in Boston. Whitman's Leaves of Grass was at first a financial failure. Only 3 enthusiastic reviews that it received were written by the author himself, anonymously. But in time, the once withered Leaves of Grass revived and honored, won for Whitman an enormous following in both America and Europe, and gained him the informal title, Poet Laureate of Democracy. Singing with transcendental abandon of his love for the masses, he caught the exuberant enthusiasm of an expanding America that had turned its back on the world. All the past we leave behind, we debouch upon a newer, mightier world, varied world. Fresh and strong the world we seize, world of labor and the march. Pioneers, oh pioneers. Here, at last, was the native art for which critics had been crying. Excuse me. Glowing literary lights. There's more paper in my mouth. Not fair. Okay. Certain other literary giants were not actively associated with the Transcendentalist movement, though not completely immune to its influences. Professor Henry Wadsworth Longfellow, who for many years taught modern languages at Harvard College, was one of the most popular poets ever produced in America. Handsome and urbane, he lived a generally serene life, except for the tragic deaths of 2 wives, the second of whom perished before his eyes when her dress caught fire. Writing for the genteel classes, he was adopted by the less cultured masses. His wide knowledge of European literature supplied him with many themes, but some of his most admired narrative poems, Evangeline, the songs of Hiawatha, and the courtship of Miles Standish, were based on American traditions. Immensely popular in Europe, Longfellow was the first American ever to be enshrined in the Poets' Corner of Westminster Abbey. A fighting Quaker with piercing dark eyes, John Greenleaf Whittier was the uncrowned poet laureate of the anti-slavery crusade. Less talented as a writer than Longfellow, he was vastly more important in influencing social action. His abolitionist poems cried aloud against inhumanity, injustice, and intolerance, against the outworn right, the old abuse, the pious fraud, transparent groan. There's more paper there's so much paper in my mouth. Undeterred by insults and the stoning of mobs, Whittier helped arouse a callous America on the slavery issue. He also left behind a legacy of local color sketches and verse dedicated to his native New England. Many cited Professor James Russell Lowell, who succeeded Professor Longfellow at Harvard, ranks as one of America's better poets. He was also a distinguished essayist, literary critic, and diplomat, as well as editor of Boston's Atlantic Monthly and North American Review, a diffusion of talents that hampered his poetical output. Loewe is remembered as a political satirist in his Biglow Papers, especially those of 1846 to 1848, opposing the Mexican War. Written partly as poetry in the Yankee dialect, the papers condemned in blistering terms the alleged slavery expansion designs of the Polk administration. Two women writers, whose work remains enormously popular today, also sprouted from this New England literary soil. Louisa May Alcott grew up in Concord, Massachusetts, in the blossom of transcendentalism, alongside neighbors Emerson, Thoreau, and Fuller. Her philosopher father, Bronson Alcott, occupied himself with more ideas than with earning a living, leaving his daughter to write Little Women and other books to support her mothers and sisters. Not far away in Amherst, Massachusetts, poet Emily Dickinson lived as a recluse, but created her own original world through precious gems of poetry. Her seclusion was but an extreme example of the romantic artist's desire for social remove. In deceptively spare language and simple rhyme schemes, Dickinson explored universal themes of nature, love, death, and immortality. Although she hesitated during her lifetime to publish more than a dozen of her poems, when she died, nearly 2,000 of them were found among her papers and eventually made their way into print. The most noteworthy literary figure produced by the South before the Civil War was novelist William Gilmore Simms. Quantitatively, at least, he was great. 82 books flowed from his ever-moist pen, winning for him the title The Cooper of the South. His favorite themes, captured in titles like The Yamasee and The Cacique of Kiowa, dealt with the southern frontier in colonial days and with the South during the Revolutionary War. Enormously popular in his own day, Simms ardently promoted Southern literature and won the esteem of many Northern writers, including Irving, Bryant, and Herman of Melville, among others. Yet his national and international reputation suffered after the Civil War, no doubt due to his overt pro-slavery and secessionist sentiments. I think there's only these last 2 pages. Oh, yay! Not all writers in these years believed so keenly in human goodness and social progress. A clique of contrary-minded authors plumbed the darker realms of human experience, exploring pain, fear, and grief, along with the supernatural and the subconscious. Edgar Allan Poe, who spent much of his youth in Virginia, was an eccentric genius. Orphaned at an early age, cursed with ill health, and married to a child wife of 13 who fell fatally ill of tuberculosis, he suffered hunger, cold, poverty, and debt. Failing at suicide, he took refuge in the bottle and dissipated his talent early. Poe was a gifted lyric poet, as the mesmerizing rhythms of The Raven attest. A master stylist, he also excelled in the short story, especially of the Gothic horror type, in which he shared his alcoholic nightmares with fascinated readers. Excuse me. If he did not invent the modern detective story, he at least set new high standards in tales like The Murders in the Rue Morgue. Poe was fascinated by the ghostly and ghastly, as in The Fall of the House of Usher and other stories. Obsessed with romantic anti-heroes on the verge of mental disintegration, he reflected a morbid sensibilities distinctly at odds with the usually optimistic tone of American culture. Partly for this reason, Poe has perhaps been even more prized by Europeans than by Americans. His brilliant career was cut short when he was found drunk in a Baltimore gutter and shortly thereafter died. 2 other writers reflected the continuing Calvinist obsession with original sin and with never-ending struggle between good and evil. In somber Salem, Massachusetts, writer Nathaniel Hawthorne grew up in an atmosphere heavy with the memories of his Puritan forebears and the tragedies of his father's premature death on an ocean voyage. His masterpiece was The Scarlet Letter, which describes the Puritan practice of forcing an adulteress to wear a scarlet A on her clothing. The tragic tale chronicles the psychological effects of sin on the guilty heroine Hester Prynne, a classic romantic outcast, and her secret lover Arthur Dimmesdale, the father of her baby and a minister of the gospel in Puritan Boston. In The Marble Faun, Hawthorne dealt with a group of young American artists who witness a mysterious murder in Rome. The book explores the concepts of the omnipresence of evil and the dead hand of the past weighing upon the present. Herman Melville, an orphaned and ill-educated New Yorker, went to sea as a youth and served 18 adventuresome months on a whaler. A whale ship was my Yale College and my Harvard, he wrote. Jumping ship in the South Seas, he lived among cannibals, from whom he providently escaped uneaten. His exotic tales of the South Seas were immediately popular, but his masterpiece, Moby Dick, was not. This epic novel is a complex allegory of good and evil, told by its narrator Ishmael in terms of the conflict between a whaling captain, Ahab, and a giant white whale, Moby Dick. The monomaniacal Captain Ahab, having lost a leg to the marine monster, lives only for revenge. His deterministic pursuit finally ends when Moby Dick rams and sinks Ahab's ship, leaving only one survivor. The whale's exact identity and Ahab's motives remain obscure. In the end, the untamed sea, like the terrifyingly impersonal and unknowable universe of Melville's imagination, simply rolls on. Moby Dick was widely ignored at the time of its publication. People were accustomed to more straightforward and upbeat prose. A disheartened Melville continued to write unprofitably for some years, part of the time eking out a living as a customs inspector in New York City, and then died in relative obscurity. Ironically, his brooding masterpiece about the mysterious white whale had to wait until the more jaded 20th century for readers and for proper recognition. Portrayers of the past. A distinguished group of American historians was emerging at the same time that other writers were winning distinction. Energetic George Bancroft, who as Secretary of the Navy helped found the Naval Academy at Annapolis in 1845, has deservedly received the title Father of American History. He published a spirited, super-patriotic history of the United States in 1789 in 6, originally 10, volumes, a work that grew out of his vast researches in dusty archives in Europe and America. Two other historians are read with greater pleasure and profit today. William H. Prescott, who accidentally lost the sight of an eye while in college, conserved his remaining weak vision and published classic accounts of the conquest of Mexico and Peru. Francis Parkman, whose eyes were so defective that he wrote in darkness with the aid of a guiding machine, penned a brilliant series of volumes beginning in 1851. In epic style, he chronicled the struggle between France and Britain in colonial times for the mastery of North America. Early American historians of prominence were almost without exception New Englanders, largely because the Boston area provided well-stocked libraries and stimulating literary tradition. These writers numbered abolitionists among their relatives and friends, and hence were disposed to view unsympathetically the slavery-cursed South. This made in New England interpretation dominated the writing of American history until the close of the 19th century, when pressure for the national reconciliation overcame regional bias. The history of the United States has been written by Boston, one pro-Southern historian bitterly complained, and largely written wrong. Okay, I think that's the whole chapter. Oh my god, that was so long. Okay.